So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim to understand.
Atheist and agnostic.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, Preston.
Oh, man, I'm looking forward to today's episode. We've kind of nudged at it a little bit a couple of times.
I'm excited too. I think this will be a lot like our Don't Stop Believing episode.
Yeah, a little bit. This time we're talking about morality on the Holy Watermelon Podcast.
We're getting philosophical again today, guys, and we're not philosophers. So
I think we've argued in the past, particularly in Don't Stop Believing, that we are philosophers.
anyone can be a philosopher.
If you have an opinion about philosophy, some people will argue that's enough to be a philosopher.
Well, also like our Don't Stop Believing episode, I don't know how close to an answer we're going to get today.
Morality is a tricky thing. A lot of people like to look at morality as a thing where you judge the world based on what your personal morality is, and it's basically black, white with some gray in there, and everything else is either okay or not okay. People don't think a lot about how other people have different systems of morality.
Yes. Morals are hard too because what's good to one person is not good to another person. And then how do you make laws and rules and decisions that benefit the group?
Yeah, it's complicated and tricky, and in almost every case, somebody gets offended.
Absolutely. And actually, pair this episode with Don't Stop Believing if you haven't listened to it yet, because I think, you mentioned people getting offended. This comes down to what you believe and why you believe it. So we're already getting into the weeds.
And, I mean, morality and ethics, which, depending on how you talk about them, are synonymous. Sometimes they're not synonymous, depending on how you use them.
I purposely pulled out the definition of ethics to not muddy the waters.
Perfect.
Morality today.
Excellent. So it's already too complicated, but we're going to dive in and see what we can get anyway. And so generally, morality is the line between good and evil, more or less, but that gets tricky too. And for a lot of people in the world, their morality is informed specifically by their religious philosophies, but very often not.
It's interesting. So in doing the research for this, I was actually expecting far more articles and thoughts on the side that we do get our morals from religion. I thought it'd be more 50-50, but from what I found, there's basically a consensus that we don't get our morals from religion, which is really interesting because 84% of the world's population are religious. But still, even with that, there's a consensus that we don't get our morals from religion, which we'll get into the different sides right away here. But
it's interesting that one of the last classes I had when I was finishing up my degree was looking at the modern philosophies of religion and just how religion works from the outside looking in. And specifically, part of the course looked at its effects on the government in our country. Mm-hmm. And a lot of our laws and our cultural norms and the morality that we adopt because of living in this nation that's run this way comes from the Protestant faith tradition, where things like monogamy being the only acceptable form of marriage in this country, is that a moral decision? Those it coming from a religious background who think that the only proper form of marriage can be monogamy is usually informed by the Christian tradition of no polygamy. but there's a small handful of Christian groups that think polygamy is okay. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, says that polygamy is okay. Muslims believe polygamy is okay. But Catholics and Protestants are like, no, polygamy is bad.
You know what's funny? You mentioned this, and this isn't in the notes or anything, but on an episode of QI, which is quite interesting, it's a British, for those of you who might not know, is a British celebrity trivia show. It's ridiculous. I highly recommend watching an episode on YouTube. But the host, Stephen Fry, I don't know how it comes up because they just go off the rails sometimes. But he mentions in an episode of QI, he says, it blows my mind that polygamy is legal when it's, as long as it's consenting adults, but adultery isn't illegal and that's not consensual. So just something to think about. I'm not saying polygamy is for everyone, but if you're a consenting adult and you're getting into a polygamist or open or whatever, polyamorous, whatever you want to call it, relationship, then all the power to you.
Right? And it's weird how often people need to be reminded that what is legal and what is moral don't necessarily overlap in every case.
Oh, well, we're gonna get to a quote. I don't know if you saw the quote.
I did see the one you pulled, and I look forward to that coming up.
Whoa. Preemptive trigger warning. I'll warn again when we get to it, but this is a very good example of what is moral is not always legal, and how vastly different morals can be and what it looks like when they're informed by different things. Anyway, spoiler alert, foreshadowing.
Generally, when we think about morality in the modern West, typically, pretty standardly, people like to bring up the golden rule. And I like that. It's pretty solid.
It's a great rule. I saw your note on it, and I actually cited, just because I didn't want people coming back being like, see, we do get our morality from Christianity.
The golden rule is a little older than modern Christianity.
So the first instance of the golden rule is from 1800 BCE in Egypt. So yes, the Old Testament would have been around, but this is not a Christian tradition.
Well, the Old Testament wouldn't even be around at this point.
Oh, really? I thought it was about 5,000 years old.
Oh, no.
Oh,
it's the Old Testament's a lot newer than that.
Okay. It says, due to the doer to cause that he do.
Which, I mean, that's a really poetic translation. I like it, but I could see why a lot of people would fumble with that phrase.
It sounds like a Doge meme.
A little
due
bit.
To the doer to cause that he do.
Yeah. I like it. But basically, it's do to others as you would have them do.
Unto you, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, and we'll get into it, but yeah, I think it's a good.
Solid.
If you're confused about the morals of a situation, the golden rule is actually a great reference point. And we can talk about some moral situations that would apply to. But the first one that comes to mind is gay marriage. Well, if you're going to restrict someone's right to marry, how would you feel if they restricted your right to marry? And I think that's a good lens to look through things.
It's such a weird, and we've talked about gay marriage before, and that as a moral example, I think is really interesting that a lot of people want to argue that marriage is a religious right, and yet it's governed by the state, which is not a religious body. Therefore, your argument falls flat. It's dead. Marriage is not a religious right.
No, and then, same thing, even looking at countries that are predominantly atheists, like Scandinavian countries, they still get married there.
Yeah. I mean, there's still plenty of faithful people in those countries, but they are definitely predominantly atheist now. It's kind of weird to look at, but not a terrible thing.
No. Do you want to run through the 4 types of morals?
Yeah, let's do it. So there are a good handful of views on the nature of evil, and they tend to fall into 4 categories, as Katie numbered. The first is moral absolutism. This is really common in specifically monotheistic traditions, but can come up in some polytheistic traditions as well, that good and evil are fixed concepts established by a deity or deities. and that it's all just kind of figured. And sometimes it's observable in nature, or you're meant to deduce them from common sense. So it's kind of nebulous, but there is an absolute.
This is a
this
very
is good. This is evil.
black and white type of moralism.
And there's not usually a lot of gray in there, but I mean, depending on who you talk to, there's
well, we'll get
some.
into
The less absolutist you are, the more gray there is.
yeah.
And then you've got amoralism, which is some tricky stuff where you outright deny the existence of a true good or a true evil, that everything is gray. Kind of the exact opposite of moral absolutism.
Yep.
Some atheists will fall into this category. It's a lot easier for atheists than theists to be amoralists.
I mean, there's reasons amoralism resonates with me, which
For sure.
we can dive into after we go through the 4 types. But yeah, there's definitely an argument for it.
Yeah. If this definitely jives really nicely with nihilism. If nothing matters, then what is morality? Why is it even a thing to talk about?
Yeah.
And then somewhere in between those, we have moral relativism, that holds the standards of good and evil are only products of local culture, custom, or prejudice, and in many instances are things that ought to be adjusted, especially as people become more aware of groups outside their own. And then the idea of moral universalism, that's some tricky stuff, but it's the attempt to find a compromise between absolutist sense morality and the relativist view. Universalism claims that morality is only flexible to a degree, and that what is truly good or evil can be determined by examining what is commonly considered to be evil amongst all humans.
And because you read that word for word, I'll say that one's from Wikipedia.
Yeah.
No plagiarism here.
What you doing copying straight from Wikipedia?
I copied a lot for this episode, not from Wikipedia, from all sorts of places, just because some of the quotes I found from people speaking about morality, I found were good conversation starters, right? As opposed
sure.
to me putting all my thoughts down, I thought we could dive into some of these quotes about moralism from all sides and have a conversation.
Mm-hmm. It is really well worded, though. I like it.
Thank you. I say thank you like I wrote it. Thank you.
You did good work
copy
grabbing
and paste. Copy, Control-C, Control-V.
So my wife and I have been watching for a little while The Good Place. It first showed up on NBC, but we've been watching it on Netflix because we don't have cable. And the show does a great job of exploring morality. I don't want to spoil too much of the plot for those of you who might feel interested in watching it later on. But one of the main characters, Chidi, is a moral philosopher. He did all of his work in university for his entire adult life, studying ethics and moral philosophy, and teaches it to the rest of the ensemble cast in the show, on and off throughout. And unfortunately, because he knows so much about moral philosophy, he suffers from absolute intellectual paralysis when it comes time to making any sort of decision about literally anything.
Oh, that's funny.
He is frozen by the fear. Any sort of decision paralyzes him because he's afraid of making a decision that can have a negative moral or ethical impact, I guess. Which is really frustrating.
He literally doesn't do anything.
Right.
Because you can.
This literally is what killed him.
Oh.
And so
Spoiler.
So The Good Place starts, everybody's dead. And when you're dead, the points that determine whether you would go to the good place or the bad place, they're frozen. They don't impact you any further at this point in the narrative. But he's still paralyzed by the fear of doing something morally negative.
Poor guy.
And it's a really interesting show. I love it. That's one aspect of the show. There's plenty of depth to the characters that make it absolutely lovable. And I'm just focused on that one bit because that's what applies to our subject at hand. But good stuff.
one interesting, while we're still talking about what are morals before we get into the two sides of it, one of the things I found really interesting is the Baha'i faith doesn't believe that evil exists. Baha'i is a very interesting religion. It's a very inclusive religion. If you look at their temples, there's the Star of David and crosses and the Islamic moons. So it's very inclusive, but it is its own entity. We should do an episode on Baha'i. But so they don't believe that evil even exists. It's just the lack of good. So they talk about how cold is the lack of heat and darkness is the lack of light.
And in
Does
the
that
same
mean
way,
they don't exist? I don't know. I guess it goes back to your experience, right? If I'm sitting in a dark room, I don't go, this darkness doesn't exist.
right?
It's dark, but it's an interesting,
It's an absence of light.
yeah.
And that's actually a really useful response to the issue of how can there be evil if God is good and powerful. And they say that there is no evil. There's just an absence of goodness because people either are good or they're not.
I also like it in the sense of, giving people second chances, right? Is anyone inherently evil? I mean, we can probably get into some of those arguments today, but I think most people have a lapse in judgment.
Absolutely.
So, Hitler, Ted Bundy probably are actual evil, but I think your average, person in the prison system, just, circumstances and poor judgment got to them to where they are.
For sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's challenging, especially if you're looking at morality as a reason to demonize a person. You're going to have a hard time. But
Yes, my brain already hurts thinking about. I don't, because people think, I think most people think what they do is moral.
oh, absolutely.
Just like most people, when people believe what people believe, they believe is correct. You don't believe something because you think it's wrong.
It's nonsense.
So probably, let's say 85% of what people do, they believe is moral. Have I done things that hurt people that I regret? Absolutely. That I would look back and say that was immoral of you, Katie. But day to day, I think I live morally. So it is absolutely hard to demonize someone when they think they're doing the right thing or they're doing the best they can. And, someone's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter,
Right.
Literally, Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist until there was like a benefit concert for him, and then he became a freedom fighter. It was a great marketing campaign, and absolutely apartheid was supposed to end, but the global perspective of Nelson Mandela up until his benefit concert was that he was a terrorist.
Yeah.
So
Even Mahatma Gandhi was a terrorist. Now, it's a little easier to show how he objectively may have been a scary terrorist, but he was also fighting for good things and then started fighting for better things.
right, Bobby Sands, Northern
Non-violently.
Ireland, IRA. I mean, still today, you could ask someone about, depending on who you ask about Bobby Sands, you'd get two completely different
For sure.
answers. If you're an Irish Republican, he's a freedom fighter. If you're a Irish Protestant, he's a terrorist. So how do you decide?
Yeah,
How do you-
one's sense of morality is definitely tightly tied to one's philosophy, how they see the world and what things have value. And it only gets more complicated the more you look at it.
Oh.
One can argue for a lifetime whether something has real value or not, and whether that value is worth defending, and how much you're willing to fight to preserve any given thing is a question of morality as much as it is a question of philosophy.
Absolutely. I mean, we could just go big and start talking about murder, right?
Yeah. Like capital punishment.
I was going to
That's
say murder
the
versus
great
capital
example.
punishment. What's
What's the difference?
The difference.
One is that you feel like there is a moral benefit to it when it's capital punishment. Where, I mean, some people argue that there's a moral advantage to murder, too.
Well, I was going to say, I imagine if you spoke to each murderer story, some of them might not have a good reason for it, but some of them probably did.
Yeah.
I think of Charlize Theron, the actress. Her mom killed her dad in self-defense, and she didn't go to jail. They moved from South Africa to America, but the judge said, yeah, it's self-defense. But, I mean, it is, objectively murder.
Yeah, it's interesting, the line between culpability and responsibility,
Yep.
Like, yeah, if she's defending her family, she is responsible for the death, but is she legally culpable for that death when it is protecting her family? The court said no.
Oh, we need to get a lawyer in now.
Man, so I have been reading the news lately and have got some frustrating feelings about some courts lately.
Okay.
Did you hear about Bill Cosby?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ugh.
And the reason that they decided, yeah, he should never have been in jail in the first place is it's not even, I want to say it's immoral altogether. The whole decision-making process has been made public, that he was, according to these judges, the majority of the judges on this panel said, yeah, he never should have been tried at all because the predecessor of the prosecutor who was in charge of this trial promised not to charge Cosby.
Oh.
And apparently these judges, the majority of them, are like, well, your predecessor's promises, you have to hold them up, so you should never have charged him, so Cosby goes free.
Gross.
Morally, I think that's terrible. And some of the judges on that panel agree with me. Some of them find their morality in a different philosophy that I don't know how to define yet.
Jean Valjean, Les Mis, their rule of law. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. It's the rule of law.
You go to jail for stealing a piece of bread because you literally need to survive. And yeah, that's a skewed philosophy morality.
Do we want to get into these two sides of morals?
Let's do it.
Anything else you want to?
I think we're solid.
Awesome. So I have two headings in our show notes of where morals come from. The pro-religion, that's where morals come from religion. And then we have a humanist side. And I actually, like I said, I had trouble finding more in favor of religion than I thought I would.
Sure. So some people say that morals straight up are taught by the gods or God. And I don't know if you've been paying attention to some of my commentary in the past about Hellenism, but the father of the gods, the king of the gods, good old Zeus, does not teach morality. In fact, is a terrible example of a moral figure.
Yes. And there are other gods in that pantheon that aren't great either.
Well,
but Zeus is particular.
Are there any that are really like stand-up guys or girls based on our morality right now? Like off the top of my head, I don't remember a lot about Artemis, but I think she's all right.
She was my favorite when we learned about it in grade 6. So they censor her a lot, but she was like the goddess of the hunt and the moon and animals and nature.
I can't think of anything to complain about her.
I can't think of anything to complain about her either.
Zeus straight up was a rapist.
Yeah. Dionysus was a drunkard. Aphrodite in Free Love is probably a little more moral these days than 300 years ago.
Her morality is definitely not as problematic as Zeus's. Like, I don't think she was ever, hey, rape is cool because it's sex. That's not, I don't think that was ever a thing. So I think we're still on pretty solid ground with Aphrodite, unless there's something I've forgotten.
Well, when we do our Greek Pantheon episode, we'll find out.
But for, let's say specifically Christians, Muslims, Jews, the God of these traditions is meant to be seen as a righteous figure. And some of the stories don't reflect the same morality that is common today, but overall he's meant to be seen as the pillar of moral rectitude.
Well, and even from the Hebrew Bible to the Christian Bible to the Quran,
There's some
morals of
differences in
God
flavor.
shifts drastically. So, and we'll get more onto that. But I found a quote that I'm going to read.
Go for it.
The view that non-religious individuals are morally dubious is deeply embedded in American society. Atheists and agnostics are considered less trustworthy, even immoral, which explains why people don't believe in God are unlikely to be elected to high political office, such as President of the United States.
Which is why so many elected officials pretend to go to church way more often than they ever do. Which is a problem, because if you're catching somebody in that kind of lie, it should make them harder to trust. And yet, for some reason, the whole of the public doesn't seem to have an issue with this.
What are the reasons you think that's the case? I need to word that question
People,
better. You know
people
what I'm asking?
make choices about what to believe sometimes. We've talked about how sometimes you can choose to believe a thing. Sometimes you believe a thing because you believe it. But sometimes when you have information like what this president is probably not as religious as he's showing off, and you can kind of tell by looking at him, some people choose to believe that there's a narrative that is favorable, and they're going to go with it just because it's convenient to them. Like, I want to believe that he's as good as I want him to be, kind of thing.
And because he's religious, it's more likely?
I guess.
Because, like you said, we have proof that morals don't come from religion.
Right.
So it shouldn't matter, but apparently it matters like a ton.
Yeah. An awful lot of people, and I've heard it several times, believe that if you don't believe in a God, then you have no reason to be moral. Which, there's loads of problems with that argument.
Yes, that's in the next section on the humanist side of things, but you're absolutely right. We have talked about it in the past. I think it was like way back in the beginning, that episode, where we talked about religion being genetic and arguably, therefore, morals. No, morals are genetic. Kidding. It's the debate on whether religion is genetic or not, or what benefit it has, and how being religious is beneficial to people. And I think that ties in with morality.
Absolutely,
And
it does.
what you think is moral.
Hey?
Am I making any sense?
I think so.
Okay.
So we were saying that religion is useful for humanity up to this point in our social evolution, that it helps us to organize our place in the world and the world around us in a way that we can understand it. And morality absolutely has been there along every step of the way. It helps us navigate our relationships with other people and the world around us at large. And I think that falls into what you were saying pretty fairly.
Okay. Another quote, again, I just found all these great quotes, talking points that, again, was for religion as our source of morals. Says, one answer to this is that moral values comes from religion, transmitted through sacred texts and religious authorities, and that even the values of non-religious people have been absorbed from the religious history around them. And I'll interject and say that makes sense if 84% of the world is religious, that the remaining 16%, very well likely, as the minority, could absorb their morals.
Like I said, some of your morality has been the product of the Protestant faith tradition that's kind of helped and formed the colonization of North America.
And you know what? As someone who's an atheist but married and monogamous, I can't disagree. Some people, this is back to the quote, everyone, some people worry that a general move away from religious faith will bring about some kind of moral breakdown in society. But a humanist will argue that moral values are not dependent on religion, and it is a potentially damaging idea in an increasingly secular society to assert that they are.
For sure. I don't see any issue there.
One of the notes I made too is that part of the problem with discussing religion and morality is that both terms are basically undefinable.
Morality is a lot easier to define than religion, but I mean,
Defining what is moral.
well, and I mean that's the problem is you're arguing what is good and what is bad against usually somebody who disagrees and says no, this is fine and this is perfectly acceptable and your sense of good and bad are wrong, which is complicated and frustrating for most people that have the argument.
Mm-hmm. I also remember we talked about I think it was in the beginning episode, about, morals coming from religion and humans always being religious. Is it fair, like we talk about Protestant values influencing us, but where do Protestant morals and values come from? Like how far back, right? We can say we're whatever, a Christian society, or we need a Christian God or the Abrahamic God to dictate our morals, but those morals came from somewhere.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting to look into that some of it is due directly to their connection to the Catholic tradition, and some of it is due to recognizing errors in the Catholic philosophical tradition of how people are meant to be towards each other, especially the idea that you're teaching a thing, I don't believe it, I want to be free to believe what I believe. That's the big energy of Protestantism and what led to the way that North America was colonized by Protestants. And so the whole believe what you believe in secret, don't shout it out too much, that is a Protestant specific kind of philosophy. And it's kind of nifty to see how all that evolves out of the Catholic tradition monogamy that we were talking about. The Christians, when they first spread out from Jerusalem, baptizing the world, they were a polygamous people. And then the Romans were like, polygamy bad. You can have one wife only. Do what you want. It's okay to have sex with the boys and girls down the street. To the men, not the women.
and footnote, it's not.
But this was the Roman tradition.
2,000 years ago, yeah.
And it's weird to say that it was important to them that you were monogamous, but it didn't matter who you had sex with was the moral standard. And the Catholic tradition that came up out of that Roman Christian tradition said, well, okay, yeah, monogamy, now that it's been our thing for a while because the state said so, that's fine. But stop touching little boys and girls. And as well as it stuck, it is a moral improvement.
Well, it's interesting that you say the state made the law because we see that even now. Mm-hmm. Where, you said earlier, right, where polygamy is allowed, if not encouraged, in other religious books, but you will not see it anywhere in Canada. And often these religious groups change their tune to follow the laws of the country that they're in.
In fact, every secular state on this planet says that polygamy is illegal, with one exception that I'm aware of.
Ooh.
Australia. Australia will not permit you to enter a polygamous marriage, but they will honor pre-existing marriages that are done outside of Australia.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious, you probably won't go to jail in Australia then if you have a polygamist.
No.
Because you can be arrested. I know in the States you can be arrested for polygamy.
Yes. The United States of America is a lot more anti-polygamy than most. In Canada, I don't think anybody's gone to jail for polygamy lately. The people who have been polygamous and have gone to jail have been because of other abuses.
Yes.
And that's part of the problem that is most visible when people talk about polygamy is we're talking about marrying children and other abuses.
Yes. That's where we, like I said,
But-
if you're consenting adults and you know what you're getting into,
Right?
all the power to you.
And so to me, it's weird that we have laws against polygamy when if you just say,
You
hey,
can't marry
let's
children.
enforce these other abusive, these laws against abuse, then we're going to be okay.
Yeah. You made a point that I wanted to go back to. Oh, yeah. When you said people believe what they want to believe and have the freedom to believe what they want to believe, I think this is actually a argument against morals and religion, because if we look at Christianity and all its denominations and what they believe and what they believe is moral. So the note I made is you have Westboro Baptist Church, which I think is probably the least moral group it's one of the least moral groups in North America.
It's so easy to just paint them as our typical, these are the bad Christians.
I mean, because they're the worst of the worst. But you can take elements of that, right? Like they, are adamantly against homosexuality, is the big one. I think they're the only one that pickets dead soldiers' graves. I don't think that's common in any other denomination. But
I don't think so. I hope not.
Right. So you have them who, again, hate the gays. And then we have our Lutheran pastor we talked about, first transgender leader in the Lutheran Church. Those are two very different morals in the same religion. So if we're getting our morals from religion, someone's reading the book wrong. And those are two extremes. Of course, I don't think Reverend Megan is that extreme based off of my morals, but those are polar opposites, and there's a whole bunch in between, and there might be even scary, a bigger spectrum than that. But
yeah, I think religion has a part to play in forming a person's individual sense of morality, but I don't think it's reasonable to say that religion is fully responsible for any person's individual sense of morality.
Absolutely, because you still have school and family and Sesame Street, and I mean, I make that as a bit of a joke, but
but it's a thing.
Yeah, it's a thing that we learn. They talk about sharing and all sorts of other things. It's been a long time since I watched.
Just living in a community has an effect on your sense of morality.
Yeah.
And that's why you'll notice that people behave differently in big cities than they do in little towns.
Absolutely.
Because the way they relate to their neighbors is different.
Yeah. And, I think of small town Alberta where we are. The types of people in rural Alberta are not that different. Right? You're predominantly white, you're probably Christian, you're probably conservative. So that exposure that may change your morality to, someone who's different from you, if you've never had exposure to a Muslim person, then maybe that's something you're fearful of just because you don't know. And then you'd think, Sharia law and hijabs are immoral, but it's just lack of exposure and understanding. And most people don't want to go on the internet and Google that stuff, which is why you should share the Holy Watermelon podcast with them. Absolutely.
All right.
Are we going to read this horrible quote? I think it's
it's so bad.
It's so bad. So this is absolute moralism. This is that black and white. Your morals are dictated by God and there is no gray area. This is
it's so hard to read. I'm glad I read it before going into this.
Trigger warning. Shut it off if you don't like any sort of sexual abuse. So it says, this is an interview with the Honorable Reverend Father Simon Lokoto, a Ugandan minister of ethics and integrity. So he's a father, so he's Catholic, I presume.
So already at this point, I know I got this far before knowing that I wasn't going to like what I saw.
Because Ugandan and Catholic at the same time?
Well, okay, that's a complicated combination of things. You and I went to go see the Book of Mormon musical together.
Fantastic.
Takes place in Uganda. And the interesting thing about that is that it's set in Uganda because it's such a weird place. Culturally speaking, it's very, I'm going to say abrasive, I guess.
I was going to say it's very first century. Like it's very, so in Uganda, it's very much illegal to be gay. There's still hundreds of countries around the world where it's illegal to, well, lots of countries. There's only 200 countries in the world, so hundreds is inaccurate. But there's lots of countries, the majority of countries around the world, being homosexual is still illegal. But you can actually be stoned to death in Uganda for being gay or being accused of being gay. So
relative to the Book of Mormon musical, it's interesting that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, last I checked, has no presence in Uganda. They're in most of Africa and certainly pretty much everywhere else in the world. There's a handful of Muslim states where they're not really actively present in. Uganda is a place where they've straight up avoided for a little while.
Yep.
This is a culturally different than you're used to place.
Yes.
All right, let's get back into Simon Lakota, the Honorable Reverend.
Honorable Reverend Father.
What does he say?
So, again, this is a country where homosexuality is illegal. He's obviously Catholic, where I think even Pope Francis is warming up to gay marriage, but I think it's still discouraged. So he viewed the heterosexual rape of young girls as preferable to homosexuality, to consensual homosexuality. So he prefers that adult males sexually abuse little girls to two men consensually having sex with each other. So Lakota says, I say, let them do it, but the right way.
The interviewer says, oh, let them do it the right way? Let them rape children the right way? What are you talking about?
And Lakota says, no, I'm saying at least it's the natural way of desiring sex.
So gross.
And so this is someone who gets his morals from religion and moral absolutism from religion. And there is a problem with this.
But it's not just religion. I mean, he's certainly influenced by his cultural background. But it's just the way he sees the world to validate saying this. And this is the Ugandan Minister of Ethics.
And integrity. What do you think? Do you think he'll get sainted? I'm kidding. I hope not.
I mean, who did we talk about that did get sainted? We talked about some terrible people. So we'll see.
Yeah, so that's really gross. And I think it's a great argument for and you're right, there are cultural factors, but even the term natural way of desiring sex, where does that come from? Right?
I mean, if you're born with it, it's natural, right? So, again, he's having a philosophical argument.
Yeah.
Which is not a popular argument right now, the way he's coming at it.
No, it's pretty terrible. Anyway, trigger warning off. If you're tuning back in for now. So now we're going to dive into the humanist side of where do we actually get our morals from, if not from religion, and how do atheists like me live a half-decent life?
How do you do it?
I mean, Yeah, so one of the challenges with morals not coming from religion is that non-religious people can't explain where morals come from, if not from God.
Well, you say can't, and people have tried, and people have come up with some pretty great explanations.
So the best I found is that it's emotional and genetic, and we've talked about this before, where if you're immoral, if you're killing and stealing and whatever, the chances of you having offspring are lowered.
Well, yeah, especially if you look back in history where you would have been stoned for that activity. We have rules as a society, and that has an effect on morality. I don't want to say that they're directly connected. One leads to the other directly, immediately, but there's an effect that one has on the other both ways, I think. Mm-hmm. It's not simple.
What? Us having a hard conversation, say it ain't so.
You got a thing?
I have a thing and I just can't. I don't know if I made a note on here. I didn't make a note, but it was Richard Dawkins' talk, I believe. And the question of, oh, well, if you don't believe in God, how can you be a good person? And so he
called
said,
Don't Be a Monster.
Right. So he asked people to come up with something bad that a religious person could do or has done. And then to give an example of something good that an atheist couldn't perform, and so we can think of lots of things that religious people have done that are bad, but we can't think of anything that an atheist couldn't do.
Right.
So anyway,
It's an interesting way to illustrate that. I like that.
I thought it was pretty good because, I mean, like you said, there's obviously lots of examples of atheists behaving poorly.
Yeah, there's...
I'm not saying that because you're religious, you're bad, but it's an easier, right? Like what can you do, Preston, that I couldn't do? That's a good moral thing.
Right. I don't think there's anything on that list.
Oh, good.
I don't think that's how that works.
Okay, well, then there we go. You have some notes.
I do have some notes. I found Lawrence Kohlberg's model of moral development pretty useful. The first stage is oriented around obedience for fear of punishment.
So this is like the primal reason, your primal instinct to be good.
Base reason why not to be a dick is because you're going to get beat for hurting somebody else. Basic fear of punishment leads you to this basest form of morality. The second stage is essentially oriented around the reward for good behavior. Oh, don't be bad, but also do a good thing and I can get some sort of reward. Kind of nice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then the third stage of morality centers on making your tribe happy and maybe even bringing a little bit of pride to yourself.
I like that, right? Because you do things to make your friends and family and spouse happy. Yeah.
The fourth stage is about doing your duty, upholding the law so that you can expect the same of others. We're getting to some pretty strong morality of building a good community where you can feel safe because you're doing the things that you need to do and expecting others around you to do the same.
I don't want to interject too much. I don't want to get too off topic, but I forget who I was talking to, but we were talking about COVID and things are opening up and people are still debating masks and vaccines. And I don't know who I was talking to. If you're listening, let me know and I'll shout you out. But he said, we've gotten so caught up in what is our rights as citizens that we've forgotten what our responsibilities are as citizens, and often rights and responsibilities. And that's what this reminds me of. And we're obviously left-leaning people, so we've both been vaccinated and have masks, and we look at people who are choosing not to as immoral because this is a great example. They're not holding up their responsibility to society and rule following.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially not all people who don't get the vaccine.
I know.
There's
Sorry,
some who medically reasons
I didn't mean to broad stroke that,
but broad stroking it, it's certainly morally questionable to go without a vaccine when you can get it.
It's fifth stage.
Yeah, the fifth stage. Now we're getting into the more evolved sense of morality, I guess. The fifth stage is centered around the consensus of thoughtful men. That's the phrase that Kohlberg used, and I like it. It's doing what is right according to your society to preserve your pride and the pride of others that other people place in you, and thinking about what is an effective good and doing it.
This is that when your parents sit you down and they say, "I'm not angry, I'm disappointed."
A little bit, yeah.
That's what that is.
That's a lot of what that is.
I'm not
And-
angry, Preston. I'm just disappointed in
Right.
you.
And
And that hurts so much more. You're like, just yell at me.
but you have some people who aren't so philosophically morally evolved that expression doesn't work on them. And that's frustrating.
Now you're entering the world of narcissism.
Narcissism is a dangerous beast when it comes to morality.
We're not going to touch on that. We're skipping that.
And the sixth and final stage on Kohlberg's model is pretty much the basis of the golden rule, examining the morality of your actions through the lens of what if everybody did this all the time? So, why is rape immoral? Imagine suffering, being on the suffering end of that all the time. Obviously, it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
Morality got real easy there.
Yeah, it did. I like that, and I think it's a good segue into something that Frans de Waal, he's a Dutch primatologist. I have a few points by him, but he says, if we made our decisions based, I'm paraphrasing, but if we made our decisions based off of a religious book, then we would open that book every time we were struggling with a decision.
And there are lots of Christians that I've seen do that.
Really?
And it's really frustrating.
Isn't it especially frustrating because you can just find a passage that fits what you want to do?
Absolutely you can.
Ergo,
Hey,
you still don't.
Well, so I've mentioned how the story of Lot and his two daughters is. I
Rapey
found
daughters.
people who think that that's meant to be a moral story of good behavior. That an awful lot of people have been locked inside their homes for the last year and a half. I really hope that nobody is looking to this passage for a guidance on how they should be behaving right now.
Gross.
I feel very confident I'm right, that nobody's doing that. But I have to admit that there's a 1 in a billion chance that I'm wrong. And I really hope it's only that small.
Right. So, and since we're talking about Frans de Waal already, it's like I say, he's a primatologist. He studies primates. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because he says that primates have a moral code, and they show no signs of religion. There's you don't see monkeys worshiping or making sacrifices or having prayer circles, but they do have a moral code. And there's lots of other animals that have moral codes. Crows will hold grudges.
Mm-hmm. Actually, back to primates.
Okay.
I think it was baboons. It might have been different primates, but I think it was baboons. They had a whole population where all of the male baboons were killed off and they were gone. It was just females. And then they had males born, and they were raised in a far less violent society because in primates, the females aren't nearly as violent as the males.
Weird, just like humans.
There's a lot less there's a lot less evidence that you're wrong than there is that you're right. Human men tend to be more
Okay,
violent.
you worded that in a weird way that I was like, is he tricking me?
No, not trying to be tricky. And so with these baboons, when the male baboons grew up, they were taught to be less violent. And when they were beaten and caused.
Oh, when they
and
were
taught,
violent, they were beaten.
Yeah, they were taught to be less violent, and they became less violent. And then when outsider males would come, the same thing. They would be taught to be less violent, forcefully sometimes. And that, I think that's a really good example of that morality that's being taught within this population of beings that we definitely count as less intelligent than ourselves, when they seem to have morality figured out better than many of us.
This is a sad example, but like an abused dog. Mm-hmm. I have a friend who has a dog that better now, but was abused by men and was scared of men, right? So it's a learned behavior, and it obviously did not like being abused. And, kind of like crows holding grudges, it had an idea of who was dangerous. And so if there were no morals, it'd just be like, okay, I guess I deserve this.
Oh, could you imagine living in a world where everything that you experience is because you deserve it?
There's a TV show there.
I guess. Like, that instant karma idea is... I find peace knowing that I don't deserve everything that comes to me, good or bad. Can you imagine if you deserved you get a flat tire on your way to someplace and you're on
I'd
a
be
time-sensitive
so sad.
schedule? The feeling that you deserve this bad thing happening to you, that would ruin a lot of people. And there's far worse things happening to people who are far too young to deserve bad things.
Wow, Preston. That was a dark philosophical discussion.
The world is a dark, scary philosophical place.
I like this quote by Richard Dawkins, and I think it brings up a good talking point. He says that there's a moral zeitgeist that's continually evolving in society, generally progressing towards more liberal ideas. And as it progresses, moral consensus influences how religious leaders interpret their holy writings. Morality, therefore, does not originate from the Bible. Rather, our moral progress informs what parts of the Bible Christians accept and what they now dismiss.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It just makes, if you think of things that even 20 years ago, Preston and I are both Office fans. I honestly don't think if The Office premiered today, it would fly.
Oh, the second episode would have ruined the show.
Absolutely. And we can still go back and laugh at it, but it's this different context. Whereas now it would not. And I mean, I didn't watch a lot of Friends, but I know Seinfeld for sure, same thing. And these are not that old. Seinfeld's 40 years old.
I don't think it's 40 years old.
It came out in the 80s.
Did it really start in the 80s?
Yeah, I mean, Friends started in 1994.
Okay,
Friends
that sounds right.
Yeah, so
almost 30.
Seinfeld's is probably 5 to 10 years older.
I remember it was on the air when I was watching TV as a kid.
I used to watch Seinfeld with my dad all the time, but it's from the 80s.
Okay. Wow, time flies.
And that's just 40 years ago. You could look back to the 50s where we didn't have gay people because they couldn't even. We had gay people.
They just
that was a hyperbole.
They weren't super visible on every TV program.
No, and we go back to sanatoriums and how we dealt with neurodivergent people, and then you go back hundreds of years and what we thought was moral versus now. And the Bible, if I'm not mistaken, hasn't changed a lot in.
Well, that depends on who you ask. You've got people who say the Bible was perfect when it was published in 1611 under the authorization of King James, and no other version of the Bible in any language is any good. Which, I mean, that's a philosophical problem that is completely indefensible. But, yeah, the Bible largely doesn't change a whole lot, but the way people use it absolutely changes from decade to decade, and more rapidly lately than, say, 200 years ago. But yeah, I think it's interesting that the Bible, as when we talk about the parts of it that include laws and not worry about so much about the testimonies and prophecies and whatnot, the legal codes in the Bible, they're more and more recently being recognized as, oh yeah, this was an evolving text written by people based on the needs of their nation as time went on, rather than, yeah, God gave it in its perfect entirety and that's why it never changes. So now people are finding it easier to say, oh, well, this thing that seems super sketchy and morally kind of problematic, it's easier to recognize that this was the product of the people rather than the God they worshipped.
Now, while we're talking about rules and laws, what are your thoughts on people who say, I need religion to be a good person? It keeps me good.
Those are the people that can't be trusted.
Run far, run fast.
So imagine I am only moral because I am committed to my faith tradition, to my congregation, and something causes me to stop believing that this congregation is worth my time, worth the energy of mind. that it becomes a lot easier to shed the morals of that group and do the things that I wanted to do but didn't because of my faith morality. That's a huge, scary problem.
This has actually happened in real life.
Absolutely, it has. It's happened a lot.
There was some metal guy, some metal musician, like fairly famous. I could grab his name if we're so interested, but
Take a second, do it.
okay.
It's totally worth it.
Brian, who's the guy who put a hit on his wife after he left Christianity? Yep, that's right.
Wow.
All right, so Tim Lambesis from As I Lay Dying was a devout Christian, and then I don't know fully what happened to him, but I think he like got into drugs, like he had some schism in his own personal life, and he left Christianity, and then he put a hit out on his wife
That's
because
so
he realized
scary.
nothing mattered, and
That's
so he
scary.
decided to kill his wife with a hitman. He didn't do it himself. Got to keep his hands clean.
I guess there's that. What a
So that's
What a
why we run
world.
far and run fast from people who say they need religion to
Right.
keep them good.
right. It's scary stuff. The relationship between religion and morality is a weird one. Like we look at, say, Saint Teresa of Calcutta.
Our favorite.
We talked about her a little while ago, and I couldn't not bring her up again. Now that I know more about her, she's a great example for the question of morality. Either you agree with her religious philosophy that causing sick people to suffer is the thing that makes the world better, or that tricking people into religious rites is noble, or maybe you're more interested in the more modern secular morality and believe that Teresa is a monstrous hypocrite who deliberately acted deceitfully, betraying the trust of those in her care and defrauding a global community of donors. All depends on what your philosophy is. Some still praise her because to them, baptizing people is what gets you into heaven. Catholic tradition also states that liars, thieves, and traitors go to hell.
Oh, she's confusing. I'm confused.
So the real question is, which has the greater value, positive or negative? Which means more to her moral status?
In the eyes of the Catholic Church, it was the money that she brought in.
I mean, they sainted her.
They sainted
They
her.
put her on the fast track to sainthood.
Yeah.
So that's where the church stands on that.
I added this like literally hours before you showed up. But there is and again, I don't want to sound like I'm broad stroking anyone, but there was a study done in 2015 with kids across 6 different countries. And it was a mix of religious and non-religious, and it was across religions. Their biggest groups were Christian and Muslim, but they had Hindu, Sikhs. Not enough of those other ones, other than Christian and Muslim, to get comparisons across anything other than Christian, Muslim, and atheist. But it was a diverse sampling, and I pulled a few articles to read. And they're all worded differently. Everything from are religious kids are more selfish, they're meaner, or non-religious kids are more generous. So the experiment is kids were given a sheet of 30 stickers, and they got to pick their favorite 10. And then they were told afterwards, they're like, "Oh, sorry, there aren't enough stickers to go around. Do you mind giving some of your stickers to the other kids?" And statistically, non-religious kids gave about 50% of their stickers away. And religious kids only give about 40% of their stickers away. So they keep more for themselves. And again, I saw everything from meaner to selfish to whatever. But it was pretty standard. And as kids got older, their generosity level became more pronounced. So as religious kids got older, they gave away fewer. Mm-hmm. And as atheist kids got older, they gave away more. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and it's that same sort of behavior is absolutely visible in politics here in North America. people like to talk a lot about the religious right because most conservatives identify that way because of their religious associations. And yet nobody talks about the religious left, where people like to say the Democrats are godless people and the liberals
Which is
here.
statistically impossible in the United States.
Right.
Because just in the last election, it was pretty close to 50-50. And more than 50% of America is religious. So some Democrats are not godless.
Well,
heathens.
an awful lot of people lean left because of their faith.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that the godless liberals certainly outnumber vastly the godless conservatives, which tells you a little bit about morality and the need to take care of your neighbors.
One theory from this study is that, religious people put in their time. They filled their moral cup on Sunday or Saturday or Friday. So they don't need to be
They don't
as
need
generous.
to be good the rest of the week.
They don't need to be as generous outside of that. It's also, researchers are also concluded that non-religious kids make decisions more from reason and logic, whereas religious kids go back to that absolute moralism of black and white decision-making laws and codes and doctrine.
It's frustrating how tribal humanity is. Even in this age of globalization, we still look at tribes. And if you're a church-going person, whatever your faith tradition is, if you're meeting with your faith community on a regular basis, you're going to look at them as your tribe, that they get your charity. And everybody outside, maybe they got some, but not nearly as much.
Yep, that's a huge. I guess it's not a problem if you're religious. Here's a moral question, but it's potentially a huge problem when you're just giving within your own community.
Right. And for those people who don't have a faith community that they attend on a weekly basis, they're a lot more likely to see the larger civic community as that group that needs their attention and their help and is worthy of giving. It's weird to watch.
Well, and there's so many examples of it. I don't want to get too political, but there's a lot happening in the world right now that are good examples of that.
Absolutely.
I think about the Indigenous kids we've been finding across Canada. And I've talked to a few people and they're just like shocked and appalled, which is great. I mean, that should be your response. But like, I'm not shocked. I'm sad.
Right.
But
But we knew about it.
Right. And it's just, and part of me is like, you just haven't been listening for the years and years and years that our First Nations have said this was horrible.
I have family who still denies that our nation has been hurting the First Nations people.
Right. And this is where, and I don't want to sound all, high and mighty, but this is, we've been told for years. We have a good friend of ours who, she said, don't celebrate Canada Day. I don't celebrate Canada Day. Don't celebrate Canada Day. And now this is the year that everyone's like, we're not celebrating Canada Day. And I'm like, yeah, this is like, still late for us as white settlers. But we've, kind of laid low for the last 3 or 4 years for Canada Day.
Immigration status is an interesting thing.
From morals and...
Well, even just, it's more simple than morally speaking.
Yeah.
Like, loads of people just like to say all white people are settlers. I mean, if I go back to Saskatchewan, I'm not a settler. My family bought the land that they live on, and I was born there. I am a native Saskatchewanite. However, where I am now, bam, all over again, I'm a settler.
I mean... You're whitewashing history, Preston.
I don't think whitewashing is the right word for it, but it's definitely a view that a lot of people are way more committed to saying, I deserve to be here because I said so. And I mean, as a people, the white people came in and destroyed people's lives and livelihoods, their homes, their families, and that's super screwed up. And the morality behind downplaying it and not fixing the system that's caused all this damage, hugely problematic.
Yes. Any final thoughts? We're at the end of our notes.
Yeah.
We've talked for hours.
I think the big thesis that I threw together at the end of our notes is a good, solid way to finish this off. Religious piety and zeal are not reliable predictors for ethical behavior. Way too many religious people are absolutely awful. Way too many atheists are actually good neighbors who take care of each other and aren't bad people.
Yes.
Religion and ethics and morality, sure, you can argue for a long time that they have gone together in the development of human culture, but somebody going to church every week or every day when that's an option doesn't mean they're going to behave ethically or morally.
No.
At least not in a way that, okay, like we said, more to them, I'm sure that they think they're acting ethically or morally. If you were to ask them, they would say so. That doesn't mean they're acting according to the ethics of our community.
Not following Kohlberg's model of moral development.
Yeah. That sixth stage of what if everybody did this all the time really should help you navigate morality. It's a solid rule.
I like it.
And I like his wording. Like, it's basically the golden rule, but the way he words it is good.
It's reflective.
Yeah.
You're asking yourself a question.
Yeah. And it's important to be able to think about it, to come up with an answer. And the way he adds all the time is actually really helpful.
Right, because you might go, oh, what's me stealing a candy bar from the convenience store? But if that happened to the store owner all the time, right? It's the idea of the few wreck it for the many. Right?
Yeah.
We've all been affected by a shitty store or business policy because the few have. Right. I mean, I updated my business policies a couple weeks ago because I had a shitty customer. And if that happened all the time, I would be out of business. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I agree. I think that's a good way to, if every customer that came into that convenience store stole a bar of candy, I mean, potentially it could have huge ripple effects. The convenience store would go out of business. Mm-hmm. But if it happened to every convenience store, Nestle would go out of business.
Which would be okay.
They just need more ethical chocolate practices.
And it's not just their chocolate. They've got many ethical issues.
Hershey's, Dairy Milk. Is Dairy Milk Hershey's?
I don't know.
Let's pick an ethical chocolate brand. Fill in your ethical chocolate brand.
I like that people are paying more attention to ethical business practices than they have been in the past.
Absolutely. I think we're about to see a big change.
I think you're right. I hope you're right.
This might not go in the episode, but I think the problem is that you can't emotionally care about too many things. Like, I'm not saying don't care about anything.
At some point, your mind stops.
But if you cared about everything,
you're a wreck.
You'd be a wreck, right? And I mean, we just go on Instagram and between Israel, Palestine, and our First Nations, like, again, I'm not saying don't care, but it's hard to care about
everything.
You can't care about everything. Pick 2 or 3 is and go hard on those. And if everyone picked 2 or 3 things that they really cared about, we'd change the planet.
Yeah. And, well, okay. I want to add a caveat to that.
That's moral.
Pick a few things you really care about. And also, don't just ignore the people who care about other things that you can
absolutely
recognize as important.
Yeah.
Even if you're not going to join the fight, that doesn't mean you shouldn't acknowledge that their worry is worth it.
Cool. If you disagree with us or agree with us, this is a great episode to jump onto our Discord. A link is in the show notes. We'd love to hear your thoughts on morality and what you think is moral and where you get your morality from.
And if you like listening to us and want to help us keep this show alive into the years of the future, help support us on Patreon. Peace be with you.
salvation for
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecies had fulfilled itself.
God is near.